All right, so we're going to continue our study this morning on the Apostle Paul. We've looked up until now through his conversion story. We're going to pick up today, right after his conversion, here in Acts chapter 9. We took a hiatus last week for the Deep Youth Conference, so we'll pick up in Acts 9 from where we were 2 weeks ago. And so our title for the lesson today is going to be Paul Prepares for Ministry. We're going to look today at this small interlude between his conversion story on the road to Damascus and when he sort of officially meets the rest of the disciples and apostles in Jerusalem. There's about a 3-year window that we don't know a lot about. We can make some inferences about that. We're looking today at that 3-year window between kind of those other events in his life. But before we dive in, we'll do a quick review. And here we go. All right, so our lesson 1 was titled Wrong Way. And so what was the wrong way that Paul was traveling during the first kind of phase of his life? All right, he was a very, very strong persecutor, opposer of the church. And he did a lot of pretty horrible things, you would probably say, to the church there. And we talked about his resume and his training, his upbringing. What are some of the highlights about where Paul came from, his background? Who did he train underneath? Gamaliel. He trained under the teacher of teachers, the rabbi of rabbis, Gamaliel. What were other highlights or key features about Paul's background? So he was a Jew. He was trained in Jerusalem, but he was also a citizen of Rome, right? He was a Pharisee. He had a very rich pedigree of both his bloodline. Remember, he was from the tribe of Benjamin, the same tribe that gave rise to Saul and also Queen Esther. So he came from both his bloodline, but also from his training as well. He had this very, very rich history. All right, so he says that if anyone has a right to brag about their history, it's me, but he says, I'm not going to brag about my history, I'm going to brag about Christ, because he had an important transition in his life there on that road to Damascus. All right, and then 2 weeks ago we looked at his conversion on the road to Damascus, the U-turn, if you will. And what was the symbolism we talked about 2 weeks ago about his conversion on the road to Damascus? The light versus the dark. How did that play into that conversion story? Say again? All right, yeah. So there was a super bright light that shone down on him, even in midday. It was so bright. So we had that contrast of extremely bright light, but then Paul, or Saul at the time, was blinded. And so he went from being extremely bright to completely dark. And that eventually he would regain his sight when he met Ananias there in Damascus. So we talked about a lot of symbolism between the light and the dark, his conversion from being a persecutor of the church to being one of the most prolific preachers of the gospel. All right, so then we move on now to our lesson for today, which is going to be all about slowing down. All right, so when you're driving down the road and you see a slow down sign, what kinds of environments do you typically see slow signs? All right, road work. Yeah, when there's construction or road work ahead, you'll see that slow down sign. Where else? School zones, yeah, and also residential areas. Those are all the same ones that I thought about. So here we have our slow down sign in a neighborhood. We see there the slow down sign in those construction or work zones. And then we also see them very commonly in the school zones. Now, why? Why do you see slow down signs in these areas as you're driving around town? All right, be cautious. Why should we be cautious in these areas? Safety, exactly. It's all about safety here. All right, whether you're in a neighborhood with kids running across the street, or a school zone with kids running across the street, or if you are in a construction zone and there are workers out, right? We're trying to be aware of everybody in our environment, both for their safety, but also for our safety as well. When you're in construction zones, there may be construction equipment, there may be potholes, there may be people, right? All kinds of things that could go wrong if you're flying down there too fast. And so we're told to slow down in those environments. So right here, we're looking in Acts chapter 9, and Paul has just been converted. Now he is a Christian. He's going to take about 3 years to, we'll say, slow down a little bit before he dives headfirst into his gospel ministry. And we're going to look at why Paul slowed down during that time and why we should also slow down sometimes, even in our own spiritual lives. All right? So if you're not there already, turn over to Acts chapter 9. And we're going to start off here with his time there in Damascus. So, verse 19, he has just finished his conversion. He's baptized. He regained his sight. And then it says the very end of verse 18, he arose and was baptized. And then verse 19, and taking food, he was strengthened. And then for some days, he was with the disciples at Damascus. All right, so he's just been baptized. He's just regained his sight. And he's going to spend some days here with Ananias, who was the guy that baptized him, and the other disciples who are right there with him in Damascus. But what does Paul do immediately in verse 20? He proclaims Jesus, right? Paul is a man that doesn't waste time, right? He is a go-getter. Now, he's been going and getting the Christians in a bad way up until now. But immediately after he was baptized, he starts preaching the gospel. Verse 20, and immediately he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogues, this is in Damascus, saying, He is the Son of God. And all who heard him were amazed and said, Is not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem of those who called upon his name? And has he not come here for this purpose, to bring them bound before the chief priests? But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. All right, this right here is a U-turn. If there's ever been a U-turn, this is a U-turn right here. Paul's walking in one direction, persecuting the church. And they know he's coming for us right here in Damascus. But now all of a sudden he's in the synagogues and he's preaching Christ is the Son of God. He's preaching the gospel. And the people around are confused. Both the Christians and the Jews, the non-Christians, if you will. They're all confused. Like, what is going on right here? We just saw this man in Jerusalem arresting people, dragging them by their feet to jail. And he's come to Damascus for the exact same purpose. And we're waiting on him. The Jews are excited, right? They're soldiers coming in to help them out, to get these Christians out of the way. The Christians are nervous because they know what Paul's been doing in Jerusalem, but now he's doing the exact opposite of all they've heard about, of all that they were expecting. And it says, but Paul increased all the more in strength. You know, Paul was pretty strong before. When he was persecuting the church in Jerusalem, he was a very strong antagonist, adversary of the church. But here it says he's going to get even stronger. But now that strength is going to be directed not against the church, but for the church. This strength is directed for the purpose of Christ. All right, but we're going to have some conflict coming up right now in verse 23. When many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. The Jews said, I'm going to be having none of this. But their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. All right, so you read this passage here, and immediately you think, oh, they're going to kill him. Wow, that's quite dramatic. Is this very dramatic? Or is this like just their bread and butter at this point in time? This is what Paul's been doing. He's been arresting people and having them killed. So they're going to do the exact same thing to Paul that he's been doing to everybody else. So this is not a dramatic turn of events right here. This is just doing exactly what the Jews have been doing, which is arresting Christians and having them put to death. If Paul's not going to be for us on our side, then we'll just do to him the exact same thing that he's been helping us do to everybody else. But somehow the plot becomes known to Paul, whether that is hearing it through gossip, whether it is through God intervening and telling Paul what's going on. We're not really sure, but either way, Paul here becomes aware of this plot. And so he goes into hiding, and then his companions, the disciples there within Damascus, are going to, at nighttime, so under cloak of night, they're going to let him down from the roof or from a window in the side of the wall in a basket so he can leave the city without having to go through one of the gates, because they're watching the gates. They're watching for him so that they can arrest him. Now, Paul kind of references this account over in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. So if you want to turn over there real quick, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, in verse 30, he writes to the Corinthians, "If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands." So Paul references this salvation, his being saved from death, when he's writing to the Corinthians right here. But he references it as a point of weakness. Paul says right here, I needed help. Right? I was about to be arrested and killed. I was having to hide from these people who were after me, but my friends and God, they helped me out here. And he boasts about his weakness, his time where he needed assistance from other people and from God. Now, I want to talk just for a few minutes here about Paul's choice right here to leave the city. When you think about someone who is a Christian and they're being persecuted, there's kind of two options. You can flee to fight another day, or you can stand and you can fight. Same is true if you're in a battle of some type. You can flee, live to fight another day, or you can stand and you can fight. Now, at this point in time, what is Paul's decision? What does he do? He flees. All right? But if you look at other passages, there's lots of references to standing firm. Let's look at a few of those. Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians 6, we have Paul writing about the armor of God. Beginning in verse 10. "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand firm, stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. So Paul, right here in his writing to the Ephesians, uses the word stand about 5 different times. He says, put on this armor and stand firm. Peter, similarly, in 1 Peter chapter 5, writes in verse 8, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. So, Paul himself writes about standing firm, not giving way. Put on the armor, stand firm against persecution, stand firm against the fiery darts of the devil. But if you look over in Matthew chapter 10, and turn over there with me, this is Christ speaking. Matthew 10, I'll start at 16 and then skip down a little bit. Matthew 10:16, this is Christ speaking. Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you'll be dragged before the governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. But then in verse 23, when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. So Christ himself tells his apostles here, if you're persecuted in one town, what should you do? Stand firm? What does he say? Flee to the next town. So we had this dichotomy here between standing firm and fleeing from persecution. So my question for you is, how do you know? How do you know when it's time to stand firm to whatever's being thrown at you? And how do you know when it's time to flee and go somewhere else, go to the next town, survive, you might say? What are your thoughts? All right, so for those who couldn't hear, Terry said that the standing firm is about standing firm in the gospel, not necessarily standing firm under physical assault. Is that? Yeah. I agree. Other thoughts? Sometimes you can't suffer fools. Say more about that. Sometimes you can have a conversation with somebody and it's not going anywhere. And it doesn't do any good to stand there and just to keep on going back and forth with them. Sometimes you have to shake the dust off your feet and move on to the next town. Other thoughts? It is, as Teresa said, it's very difficult to choose our battles sometimes. And there's not always a clear answer.
No, and
Yeah, I agree. It is difficult to know the answer to this question sometimes. Should you stand? Should you just keep on going at it? Should you say, all right, I've done all I can do right here. I'm better off going and doing that work somewhere else. You know, when you look at accounts in the Gospels of, James being killed or Stephen being stoned, right? It wasn't necessarily because they were standing firm. It was outside of their control. Like they were just literally captured and arrested. Had they the choice to leave, perhaps they would have and gotten away, but they didn't have that choice. Stephen was stoned right there on the spot. I'm sure he tried to get away, but when there's a mob around you throwing stones at you, you have limited options at that point in time. And James, of course, was arrested and beheaded. It wasn't his choice to do that. It happened to him. The point I want to make right here is I don't have all the answers. All right? I don't have a magical answer for this question, but I think it's a question we need to think about, right? When you're in different situations, and rarely will we ever be in a situation where our life is on the line, at least not here, but other areas of the world, that may be a different story. But there are situations where we are having to choose between standing versus turning our backs and saying, all right, my time, my energy is better spent, somewhere else. And that's a decision we have to be able to make sometimes. Now, Paul and Jesus both give us examples where it is okay to flee. God does not expect us to stand against physical or otherwise assault and never run away. Paul ran away right here. Christ told his disciples, if you're being persecuted, go somewhere else, right? We are given the green light in these examples to flee in those situations. But there may be a time when we feel the need to stand firm, and that's a decision we have to make for ourselves, hopefully with the help of God's guidance through that process. All right, one more passage I want to read is Proverbs 22. In Proverbs 22, I won't turn there, but I'll just read it out to y'all. Proverbs 22:3, the prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it. So the prudent, the wise man, sees danger and hides from it, but the simple go on and suffer for it. So even the wise man himself says, if you see danger, don't walk straight into it. If you see danger, go a different way or hide yourself, because the foolish man, or he calls it the simple man, is going to go straight into it and suffer because of it. All right, now let's look at what happens next. So go back over to Acts chapter 9. So they've just let him down in a basket. And then in verse 26, and when he had come to Jerusalem. So reading the account in Acts, the narrative very much seems like he left Damascus under cover of night and then went to Jerusalem, and there he met the apostles in Jerusalem. All right, so just the account in Acts kind of gives that trajectory of the story. All right, however, when we read notably Galatians, we find out there's a little window of about 3 years right between when he left Damascus under cover of night and when he would meet the apostles for the first time there in Jerusalem. So turn over with me to Galatians chapter 1. So in Galatians 1, Paul is writing to the Galatians, and he is kind of giving a defense of his apostleship. And in verse 11, he begins to kind of very briefly summarize his conversion story. He says, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age, among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him to the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and then returned again to Damascus. After 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas or Peter and remain with him 15 days. So there's a 3-year window Paul references right here between his baptism, his conversion, and then when he went to Jerusalem to meet Peter and the other apostles for the first time. So if you look here on the map, I'm going to kind of zoom in on this little area right here. So our story of Paul begins in Jerusalem. That's where he was when Stephen was stoned. That's where he was persecuting the church. And then he left Jerusalem to go to Damascus. So he traveled north, and there, on that trip to Damascus is where the bright light shined on him, and he lost his sight. And he finished going to Damascus with help because he was blind at that point in time. He was baptized in Damascus, and he preached the gospel in Damascus for a short time period, and then they tried to kill him. So he left Damascus under cover of night, and then went away into Arabia. Now, Arabia is a big place. There's a lot of desert area there. We have no idea what Paul did in Arabia. We have no idea how long he was in Arabia, because it says here in Galatians that after being in Arabia for an unspecified length of time, he returned again to Damascus, was there for a little more time, and then traveled down to Jerusalem. So the way it reads in Galatians, Damascus to Arabia and back to Damascus was about 3 years. All right? We're not really sure how much time he spent in each place, but about 3 years total, and at least part of that was off in Arabia. So what was Paul doing when he was over there in Arabia? All right? Thoughts. Paul's been persecuting the church for most of his life. He's just been converted. They've just tried to kill him, and he left the city at night. And he goes off by himself, it seems, into this more like wilderness type area. Why? What's Paul doing out there? I don't know the answer. I'm just looking for y'all to tell me. So you could be right or wrong, and I wouldn't know.
I would say he was studying the Old Testament scriptures and trying to build his faith.
All right, I would agree with that. I think that he was likely out there studying, building up his faith, better understanding the Old Testament that he already knew very well, but now from a new lens.
He's looking at it with a different viewpoint.
Exactly. Now the lens of Christ, he's reevaluating the scriptures. Jackie, what were you about to say? He prayed. I think there's a lot of prayer going on right here as well. So the reason we titled this lesson Slow Down is because it seems, at least, that Paul is going to slow down for about 3 years before he really kicks into his full gospel ministry. All right? This is his slow down era. All right? He's going to spend a lot of time, most likely, studying, praying, and a lot of meditation and reflection, most likely. Because just think about his conscience. All right? How would your conscience be if you spent 10 years killing people? And now you suddenly realize those people were following God, and you were killing them for the wrong reasons. How would that weigh on you? Extreme guilt. I mean, can you imagine the guilt that he would have to be facing right now? Paul needs some time to work through this, right? When he got converted in Damascus, he started preaching immediately. He never even had time to really digest. He never had time to reflect upon. He just turned around and started going. And then that threat on his life, I think, was somewhat of a jarring effect for him. And through his own choice, most likely through God's intervention, he's going to leave. He's going to spend some time really doing some deep thinking, some deep prayer, and some deep study. He's going to slow down, work through all the guilt that he has to be experiencing right here, and prepare to dive right back into the work when he goes to Jerusalem. All right? So I want to also look at just exactly what Jackie brought up was, what were the examples of Jesus in the context of slowing down, taking breaks? Let's go over to the Gospels, and let's read about some of the things that Jesus did. All right, let's start in Luke 4. After Christ was baptized, so think about the parallels right here. Paul has just been baptized, and he goes away into the wilderness of Arabia. Jesus has just been baptized, and what does he do in chapter 4 and verse 1? And Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by the devil. Have you thought about this parallel? Christ is baptized by John the Baptist. God says, "This is my beloved Son." A dove lands on his shoulder. And then he goes away in the wilderness for 40 days of meditation, reflection, as well as temptation, to prepare for the official beginning of his ministry. Paul is converted. He's blinded. He regains his sight. He's baptized. And then he goes away in the wilderness for however long to pray, reflect, likely be tempted by Satan while he's out there as well. All right? Until I was studying this, I never really saw that parallel between what happened with Jesus and what happened here with Paul. But Jesus did the exact same thing. Jesus went away into solitude to prepare for what he was about to embark upon, which was his ministry. All right, Luke 5, turn one or two pages over. Luke 5 and verse 15. But now even more the report about him went abroad, and great crowds gathered to hear him and be healed of their infirmities. But he would withdraw to desolate places and pray. And the he there is Jesus. And the language is, this was a regular occurrence. You might read this as, Jesus regularly withdrew to desolate places to pray. This was not a single thing that Jesus did, but this is a regular occurrence of Jesus, was to go away in solitude, to meditate, and to pray. All right? And then in Mark chapter 30, I'm not Mark. There's no Mark 30. I was like, what? Mark 6, verse 30. Mark 6 and verse 30. All right, this is prior to Jesus feeding the 5,000. Mark 6, verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. Not only did Jesus himself take time to get away, but he told his apostles to do the exact same thing. Take time, go away somewhere away from all these people, rest, eat, recharge, pray. This was a common practice of both Jesus and his apostles. And then what did Jesus do the night before his arrest? Where did he go before he was arrested? The Garden of Gethsemane. He went away, took his apostles with him, and then took just the four, Peter, James, and John, and then he even went further into the garden to be alone. All right? Regular occurrence of Christ was to get away and to be alone. Christ's example for us is just like what Paul did, right? Spend time in solitude, spend time in isolation, spend time in study, prayer, all of the above. We've got about 5 minutes left here. So my last question for you all is, how does that instruct us right here today? The examples of Jesus, the example of Paul. Do you take time away? Because if you don't, this thing that we call burnout is very, very real. We can get burnout with work, we can get burnout with family, we can get burnout spiritually just as much. And, I think that Jesus knew this. And I think that he was teaching his disciples to protect themselves from being burnt out. You've got to take time to recharge the battery so that you can keep on working for the Lord. So, how do we do this? What are some ways that we can follow Christ's example to have those moments of solitude, those moments of reflection, of prayer, of study, to avoid this spiritual burnout?
You almost have to schedule time.
We can schedule it. That's right.
You have to be purposeful.
You do got to be purposeful. If you're not purposeful, the time is never there, right? I mean, nowadays, you all know how it is. Between, work and family obligations, between, church activities, between community activities. I mean, there is stuff sun up to sundown, and even after that. So scheduling it, being very purposeful, is really important.
We also have to determine what aspect of life works for us to do that. What's good for you may not be good for me, may be stressful for one person and relaxing for somebody else.
You got to know yourself. You got to know what recharges your battery. And it may be different. Think about plugs. Different plug for everybody, right? What kind of plug do you need to recharge your battery? So reflect upon that. Understand yourself and what do you need to keep the battery recharged. What should you be doing during these times? What did Christ do during these times? He prayed. So I think a lot of prayer is going to be part of that process. Part of that plug that recharges our battery needs to be prayer. What else?
Reading the Word.
All right. You can never go wrong reading the Word. All right? So schedule time in our days to pray, to read the Word. Alone. I mean, study with a group, with your family is wonderful. But alone time is also necessary. Having that time alone to pray, reflect, and to study. And I think that idea of reflection, of meditation on the Word is also very, very underutilized. All right? I see this all the time where, and I'm guilty of this myself, I go. I never stop and just think about what am I doing? Why am I doing it? right? Just that personal reflective time is also important. Just understand yourself. Breathe. Think. Go outside and just look around and reflect upon what God has given you. What do you have access to, right? All of those things can be used as part of this time of recharging our battery. So my ask of you as we wrap up today is, this week, look at your calendar. Schedule time to recharge your battery, because God wants us to be fully charged to continue doing His work. And if our battery is empty, if we get burnt out, then we tend to throw our hands up and say, I'm not doing anything. All right? And that is definitely counterproductive. So find time this week to recharge your battery for prayer, for study, just being alone with yourself to reflect upon all this stuff that we have around us. All right? So that's my ask for you all today. All right? Next week, we are going to, this does not want to work today. There we go. We're going to merge. All right. Paul's going to leave Arabia, go back to Damascus, and then travel down to Jerusalem and begin to integrate himself with Peter and the other apostles. So he's going to merge with the disciples. So hopefully I will see you all next week. Thank you.